And now for the last session of today, to clarify the opportunities within the LIFE program for third countries, I would like to call on stage Jean-Claude Merciol, Advisor to Directorate-General Affairs, Knowledge and Resource of Directorate-General Environment, and Anne Burrell, Head of Unit Environment and Nature in CINEA. So, dear both, the floor is yours, and very soon your presentation will also pop in. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, thanks a lot, and good afternoon to all of you. And I saw, but listening to the presentation before, that it's really a lively presentation and cooperation with the participants. So it's really great. You will see soon the presentation prepared, especially by the colleague of CINEA, and maybe, because it's not really needed, or say I can start mentioning some elements before it comes. In fact, just to provide you some I would say overall information about the type of cooperation we can have with third countries, because in fact we have two types of cooperation, and it has consequences, of course, especially for the applicants and for the evaluation. We have, on the one hand, what we call the association to the LIFE program. And then for the applicants, when they belong to a country, a third country, which is associated to LIFE. I see you see the slide, I guess, no? Yes.
Yes, Jean-Claude, we see them. Yes, can you also see them?
Yeah, no, I can see them in small, which is okay. I know where we are.
If you wish, you can just, if you where you see the slides, you click on the 3 dots, and then from there you can see pin in your screens.
Okay,
that will help you in seeing it big.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Now I see what you mean. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes.
No problem.
Okay. Now it's great. No, great. Fantastic organization. So I was saying we have two types of countries that can participate. I said for the country associated, so the applicants, they can apply for project as applicants from the EU, and the other type of cooperation we have is if a third country is not associated to the program, but if an entity from such a country is willing, I try to be in front, okay, is willing to cooperate, or if its participation is needed, which is more valid, as you will see, then under certain rather restrictive conditions, so this entity can participate. But just to start with the countries that can be associated. So you see here the first slide on the country which can be associated. In fact, the Commission as a whole is in favor of this type of association. So the EU is in favor of it. And this type of association applies not only for LIFE, but it applies more generally for all the other, EU program. And for this reason, for the period 2021-2027, for the present programming period, we have, an overall standard approach for it. So all the program, they are, open to third countries. And if you look at one program or the other, you will find rather similar, provision in all the programs, because the idea is really to have an overall global approach for it. And some programs, of course, they have a long experience. For instance, Horizon Europe, just to mention one of the programs which is close to us. For LIFE, it's new, so we are, in fact, I would say, learning by doing. So we know exactly what to do, but it's step by step when implementing all these new rules that we will see how to do it. And as I said, as a whole, it's an interest for us to have countries associated to the different EU programs, and for LIFE, especially for the area of LIFE, so environment and climate, it's of specific interest for us, because as the Union wants to lead, by example in the response to address this overall global environmental and climate change, it is really useful to try to involve the LIFE program, because LIFE has its own objectives, to contribute, as they were already mentioned, I guess, to contribute to the shift toward sustainable, circular, energy efficient economy, as well renewable energy based and climate neutral. So it's a perfect instrument for this type of cooperation with third countries. And On the other hand, for the third countries, then for this association, it gives them the opportunity to test the different benefits of a strengthened cooperation and strengthen environmental, say, protection and as well environmental and climate protection. And so it's really a benefit for all of us. And as we say, as a conclusion for all of us, if we want to take measures for environment and climate, they are not linked to the EU borders. So the more we will be able to act, the better. So it's a benefit for all of us. And we have, but not entering here in the details of the rules, but we have different type of associations that can be foreseen depending on the different, I would say, countries. But just to make simple, we started some discussion with, so starting from 2021, we started discussion with the third countries who indicated their interest. And we have already Iceland, which is part. It was the first one. In this case, it's slightly specific because Iceland, of course, has, say, a specific arrangement with the EU, so it's much easier. And then we started this, say, negotiation with Ukraine and then Moldova, so who joined in 2022. And what is important, so, is that for the entity of this third country, so they can, as mentioned, they can participate, I would say, to the LIFE program as the other I would say entities from the EU, and especially what is important to know and to notice is that, of course, in the LIFE regulation, we very often make reference to regulation and legislation, EU regulation and EU legislation. And of course, in these third countries, sometimes they have already similar regulation and sometimes not. And then in case they do not have, then for the evaluation of the proposal, we will consider, I would say, the way the proposal, I would say, contribute to the principle and the objectives of environmental and climate EU policy. With a view to address these global challenges. So this is, I would say, the new element, and we will, of course, I said, learn by doing with this. And the other important element for me to consider for entities from third country associated to the program is that, of course, LIFE, we try to make it simple, easy to understand, and we have all this explanation, but in fact, it's not totally easy to participate. So maybe at the beginning, it may be useful for, I would say, applicants from third countries to try to join force with other beneficiaries who have already, I would say, some experience in the LIFE program. So it can help to better understand the program. And of course, later they can be, I would say, they can come alone or in consortium if they want. But again, they can start directly to make their own proposal, but there may be an interest for them to join force. Second slide, please. Yes, thank you. And as I said, we have two types of cooperation. We have the association I mentioned, and then in case we have projects that would involve, I would say, an entity from third country not associated, then this entity could participate, but in really limited circumstances, to the program and participate to proposal. And for this, we have again a special article which is I would say similar, I would say, to what we can find in other some programs. And basically, the idea is that on the one hand, this applicant, first of all, it cannot be, of course, the leader. The leader has to be, say, either an EU or an entity from an associated country. And then we need, I would say, really specific condition, which means that the participation, as mentioned here in the article, the participation is necessary for the achievement of the action. So it means it's not just to participate because it's a third country, we want him. No, they need to demonstrate, well, the project needs to demonstrate that the participation is necessary for the achievement. And not only for the achievement, but necessary as well for the effectiveness. So effectiveness, it means that really there is an added value from I would say the fact that this entity will participate. And for example, we could, I say, consider the idea of a project, for instance, on the migration species, and we say, okay, if we want to intervene in this specific scope, then there may be a need that we cooperate as well with some third countries, because there will be then, I would say, an interest for the activities carried in the Union or in the associated country. And so these are the two ways. But again, here, what is important for the entity of a third country is not associated, then the entity will have to support the cost. So the LIFE program will not participate to the support. So I will stop here for the global presentation, and now I invite, of course, Anne to give you, I'd say, the real substance of all this course. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude, for explaining the context, explaining which countries can participate, and the general guidelines and the principles and requirements for their participation. What I'm going to try to do now is to give you some more editorial comments on some advice on how third countries can effectively get involved in LIFE, and some of the things that you perhaps should be considering. Some of these are points that we already raised in the general introductory session this morning, but I will try to touch on them particularly as they apply to third countries. So I think the first very important issue is to understand the different types of LIFE projects and to apply to the call that's right for your project. Now, I think there are three types of calls or three types of projects which entities from third countries might want to be involved in. So I'm going to touch on each of them briefly and then maybe go into a couple of them in a bit more detail later. The first are the standard action projects, which, as you heard this morning, they have a very broad thematic scope. So this is, in a way, the easiest type of project to get involved in if you just have an idea for something that you can do that's good for the environment. However, I would emphasize that under the SAP calls, there are project topics, and if you fit those project topics, the application will get a higher score in the evaluation. And many of these project topics refer to the EU acquis, so the EU legislation and policy. Now, as you heard from Jean-Claude, it was negotiated with Moldova and Ukraine that they did not necessarily need to comply or have in place word for word the EU acquis, because in general it's not in place. However, the project topics will be interpreted then to the context of the country, the entity from which the entity is applying, but they must address the same principles and objectives as the EU acquis. So even if the laws themselves have not been transposed, we would not, for instance, finance a project which is going against any of the objectives or the principles set out in the relevant part of the EU environment acquis. So that would be a thing to look at, to see how closely your legislation fits the principles and objectives of the EU acquis, or how much your project fits it, even if the legislation is not in place. The second type of project you might consider, and I wrote here SNAPs, but in fact it's for this year it's the SIPs. For other years it could also be the SNAPs, so the strategic projects. As you will have understood from the earlier presentation, the strategic projects focus on very specific types of plans that are linked to the EU acquis. It's not just any type of environmental plan. So if you're applying from a third country, again, if you want to apply for a strategic project on a specific plan or strategy, you may do so, but it has to be a plan or strategy that falls into one of the categories for which the strategic projects can be applied. And your plan has to correspond to the overall principles and objectives in the relevant EU legislation. So that's the way it will be assessed. So both of those have a certain relationship to the EU acquis, at least to its principles and objectives. The third type of project you might want to consider is that some of the PLPs, the projects that are tackling priority legislative and policy issues, some of them are specifically addressing third countries, but we'll come back to that. But it's very important to understand the difference. And for instance, something that would be a standard action project, don't submit it under the strategic project call because it won't fit the criteria and it won't be accepted. So make sure that you understand the different calls. Next slide, please. Some of the other general things you need to consider is you shouldn't be discouraged too fast. The success rate under life calls is quite low because the competition is very high. So if you want to be successful, you have to put in a very good, high quality proposal. It's not a matter of submitting lots of proposals. It's not a numbers game. It's much more important to submit a small number of well-prepared proposals rather than just sort of throwing things out and hoping that it somehow will magically get through the evaluation process, because that won't happen. The evaluation process is very rigorous and it will evaluate the quality of your proposal. And this means you need to put time into preparing your proposal. It is certainly at least several months, and I would say that many of the successful proposals we receive have been in gestation for at least a year. Sometimes more than that. Many of our proposals, even from experienced life applicants, they may submit one time and it's not successful, and then they rework it, and maybe next year or 2 years later, it will have reached the level of maturity and quality that it succeeds and gets a grant. So you have to understand that this happens to applicants from all countries, and this is part of the nature of the competitive process. Certainly make sure you include all of the obligatory annexes, make sure you're using the correct application forms. Next, please. So if looking at all of this, you decide you want to apply for a standard action project, certainly all of the things you've heard already this morning and what you might learn tomorrow in the specific sessions for the different sub-programs you need to take into account. But in particular, I'd say make sure you have understood the evaluation criteria, understand how your project is going to be assessed, and make sure you understand what some of the key required elements are. And those include one of the evaluation criteria is the impact of the project. This is very important. You have to be able to demonstrate that your project will have a high impact, and that's done through the use of the KPIs, which are our impact indicators. So you need to be able to measure the baseline and to estimate through your project what kind of impact you will be having on the ground. You've also heard already today, but I'll repeat again, to be sure that your project includes elements that will make sure that the results are sustained, that the results can be replicated, that you're doing something that actually has the potential for being a model, for being an example that others can copy and upscale, because those kind of projects will get higher points in the evaluation. Obviously, you should look at the policy priorities, the project topics, and see if you correspond to them. You will get more points if you do correspond to them. And in doing this, also ask yourself whether LIFE is really the right funding instrument for your project. So, for instance, we are not a research program. We sometimes will finance very small elements of research in the context of the overall project if that research is essential for reaching the operational objectives of the project, but we don't finance research for the sake of research. We also do not normally finance large infrastructure. So if what you're looking for is the building of a large infrastructure, there are probably other instruments that are more appropriate and not a life SAP. And finally, it's maybe complicated and technical, but you need to understand the financial rules and understand how the budget is constructed, including you need to think about where you're going to get the co-financing for, because as you've heard, for most projects, life is paying a financing contribution of 60%, but you have to figure out where you're getting that other 40% from. Next slide, please. And this slide is something that Jean-Claude already alluded to, is that when you're coming new to life, one of the ways that you can start to get involved and learn about how life works and see how successful projects are developed and implemented is through becoming a partner in a consortium with experienced applicants, or at least applicants, even if they're not experienced in life, but who have experience in implementing large projects with the EU funding. And particularly the ones who've been in life, because they will know the life rules, they will understand very well the evaluation procedures, and it's a way for you to get a foot in the door without taking the lead responsibility for preparing and possibly implementing a project. We have set up a virtual networking tool now, and you can apply to this, and you can use this tool to look for possible project partners. And I certainly would encourage you to consider doing that. We did have our first associate beneficiary from Ukraine join a project that was signed at the end of last year. So we are starting to bring third country partners on board. There are Icelandic partners applying to projects also. I don't believe we've yet had any successful partners from Moldova, but I'm sure that will come with time too. But think about being a partner, and that will probably increase your possibilities and make your learning curve easier. I would just comment, next slide please, briefly on the, next slide please, on the PLPs. As we mentioned, these are small calls in the sense that we only will be issuing one grant per topic, but they're very specific calls. So they're kind of the opposite of the standard action projects, which have a very broad scope. These have very, very well-defined objectives. And of the 15 topics we have launched this year, 3 of them are specifically focused on Ukraine and/or Moldova. And I would just mention these 3. The first one is for supporting the implementation of the EU Birds and Habitats Directive and the Natura 2000 network in Ukraine and Moldova on the basis of the Emerald Network. As I think you know, the Emerald Network is a network of sites under the Berne Convention. And this project is intended to provide a grant to a consortium to improve the implementation of the Emerald Network as a step towards implementing that Natura 2000 network in either Ukraine and/or Moldova. So the project that we will finance could be in either country or in both countries. The second PLP I wanted to mention is one specifically targeting preparation for development of new environmental infrastructure for waste in Ukrainian cities. And I'd emphasize these are relatively small projects, so it's not going to be rebuilding large components of infrastructure, but rather doing some of the preparatory work, drawing particularly on experience from EU cities. And this project, in order to apply for this project, there must be applicants, there must be partners in the consortium, both from EU entities and from Ukrainian entities, because the idea here is to support the reconstruction in Ukraine through drawing on experience from the EU member states. So again, we will be granting one grant on this topic, and so there will certainly be some competition for it, but the successful project will definitely be one which will be meeting the requirements and bringing experience from the EU to Ukraine. And so there need to be partners from EU member state entities, so from regional authorities or municipalities or something like that in the EU. And then the third project is very similar, but it is focusing on water instead of waste. So these are the three projects which have a specific focus for Ukraine and Moldova, and definitely there need to be entities from these countries involved in the proposals, not necessarily as the lead. The lead could be from an EU partner with partners in Ukraine, or for the first one, and or Moldova, or it could be led by an entity in Ukraine with partners coming from the EU member states. So I wanted just to draw your particular attention to that, but emphasizing again, we're looking for one really good application, one winning application, which will necessarily be really good because I'm sure there'll be competition on each of these topics. So next slide, please. Now you may be wondering, saying, well, I've heard all of this, but I'm still a bit lost. Can I get help in preparing my application? Well, the first thing obviously that you need to do is read all of the call documents and the frequently asked questions, and that you'll find all of that on the funding and tenders portal. You might also be inspired by ongoing projects. So I suggest already you contact other entities, perhaps in the EU, to form partnerships, but you might contact ongoing projects just for inspiration, even if you're not planning to form a partnership with them. The only thing you need to be careful about there is that the requirements have changed over time. Life's 30 years young, but over those 30 years, obviously, things have evolved. So some of the projects from, say, 5 or 10 years ago may have been responding to slightly different eligibility requirements than the present call. So be inspired by them, but read the documents carefully. Sometimes we're asked, can we help you develop a proposal? Well, I have to be very clear on that. No, we, CINEA, nor DG Environment, we can't help you develop a proposal because it's a competitive process, and that we are not able to help you because we're also evaluating the proposals. However, if there are elements of the call documents that are unclear, you can send an email to our mailbox, and we will attempt to provide the necessary clarification. And very likely, if it's a question that hasn't already been answered clearly in the documentation, we may well post your question, your answer, on the frequently asked questions list. And this way, it provides transparency also to other applicants who might be interested in the same information. And finally, I'd stress that all countries that participate in LIFE are asked to name national contact points. And these national contact points, a large part of their job is to help provide advice and suggestions to applicants. So while we in CINEA, we can't give you advice on your proposal, your national contact point can give you that advice because they're not involved in the evaluation process. So I would also encourage you to get in touch with your national contact point and dialogue with them. Obviously, for the new countries, the national contact points are also new and are also learning, but they will certainly try to help you as much as they can. So I think that's reached the end of my presentation. There's just a final ending slide there with a few links that might be of use. So I thank you very much. I don't know whether we have any time for questions now, but maybe we could take one or two, and if not, we can always address questions in the final question and answer at the end of tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Anne. Yes, there is time for question and answers actually, and let's use Slido to see there for one last time for today the questions that are there. I think some of them are actually a bit out of scope, but exactly because of that, it's important to reply to them and specify what do we mean by third countries participating in life. So I will just follow the order that we have there. Some of them have been already asked and partially replied this morning, but I think that specifically in this case, Repetita Juvent. So Anne, if you don't mind, you just give your answer again for those that really connected only for this session today. Nevertheless, we have some 600 people connected with us at the moment. So are there plans for UK or Switzerland or Swiss-based entities to be eligible for life?
Okay, well, I'm happy to answer, but Jean-Claude might also want to complement my answer.
Of course.
And I think my answer actually will cover several of those questions
Yes.
there. At the moment, as Jean-Claude showed in his first 2 slides, the only countries that are participating in life are Iceland, Ukraine, and Moldova, and we have negotiations ongoing with North Macedonia. Therefore, entities from those countries are eligible to apply to life either as the applicant or as a partner. Entities from other countries, whether it's China, India, Africa, Switzerland, UK, anywhere else, no, they are not eligible to apply. The only way they can participate in a life project is under the very restrictive conditions that were in Jean-Claude's second slide, which is that they are necessary in order to meet the objectives inside the EU of the project. And he mentioned, indeed, migratory species. It doesn't make sense to have a project on a migratory species in the EU if it goes and winters in Senegal and all the birds are getting killed in Senegal. Therefore, it would make sense to involve an entity for Senegal. But these are exceptional conditions. In general, entities from countries other than the EU, Iceland, Ukraine, or Moldova, are not eligible for life, with the exception of North Macedonia, which is provisionally eligible because they are negotiating their participation in life.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm trying to indeed, because of that, quickly archive all the questions that are not related to this very specific session and that have all been answered by your reply now. So let's probably go to the one that, let me highlight it, from Eric. It's in here about a third country. So if a third country is in a proposal and the proposal is evaluated good, but the third country is considered as not important, will the whole proposal be rejected?
No, probably not, because first of all, I would emphasize the third country is always a partner. It can never be, the entity from the third country cannot be the applicant. So the project would still be evaluated, but it would be considered whether or not it is a highly scored project without the involvement of this third country entity. So it is possible that a project would still get a relatively good score and possibly even be financed, but with the condition that that third country entity would be removed. However, I would say, you know, if you're not sure that the third country, if you don't have a very strong argument for why the third country entity should be involved, don't put them in the first place, because you're risking getting lower scores on the way you have constructed your partnership and how you have prepared your work plan. So I'd say do some self-screening first on that.
Indeed, thanks. And I'm not sure I understand well the next question from Doreen and Matvev, but I will still read it. Maybe you do understand it. Beneficiaries from third countries must have partners also from third countries, or they can have EU partners.
Okay, if the person writing this question is asking about an application from Iceland, Ukraine, or Moldova, or potentially North Macedonia, the answer is they may have partners either from their own country, from another third country, or from the EU. They are participating on the same terms as EU entities. So they can pick their partners from any eligible countries, either the EU or the other participating third countries. And I think it's already obvious from what I said before that if the beneficiary is from a non-participating third country, then they're not eligible. They cannot submit an application. Having said that, I would just add, as I said, for the PLP projects, those specific PLP projects, the ones on water and waste in Ukraine, they require a partnership between entities in the EU and entities in the Ukraine.
Thanks, Anne. The next question, I'm afraid I know the answer, but we have time, so let's read it and give it. Are medical projects supported clinic for medical assistance, prosthesis, and rehabilitation for suffered from military actions in Ukraine?
The basic answer is no, because that's outside of the scope of the LIFE instrument. LIFE is a program to meet objectives related to environment and climate exclusively. That doesn't mean that someone in the medical sector wouldn't be doing a project to improve the environmental impact of their activities. So, for instance, we've had projects about the use of mercury in dental treatments, but the objective must be environmental. It is not, there are no medical or health objectives in the LIFE program.
Yes, thank you. And then very last question for today. The project is estimated as cross-border cooperation between Ukraine and Slovakia and non-commercial. I don't see what is the question, but maybe the question could be, would such a project be eligible?
If that's the question, I would say if it is a project involving Slovakian entities, Ukrainian entities, and it is aiming towards environmental or climate objectives and meets all of the various criteria of the call, yes, it's potentially eligible, but you have to read the calls really carefully.
Indeed, which is the bottom line message for everything we are talking about today and we will talk about tomorrow. So I would really like to thank both Anne and Jean-Claude for their contribution for this session. I would like to stress once more what Anne said about networking opportunities, because indeed that's what the platform that we are using allows you to do. You can search there for both new life beneficiaries and experienced beneficiaries. You can also sort them by countries, by topics. You'll see what they're working on. And this is certainly a very valid suggestion for participants from third countries to be able to enter life probably in a softer way and an easier way somehow. It will still be difficult, but when you have an experienced life beneficiary on your side, it's definitely an advantage. And to contact your national contact points, you can also use the platform for that. So thank you very much for that. Do not forget that we do have a session tomorrow on sub-program specific aspects, and there will be a last slot of question and answer for the question that have not been answered that we can still deal with tomorrow. So use Lido once again for today to tell us how useful this session was for you. Your feedback is really crucial for us to improve and to see if what we are doing and all the efforts is worthy or whether we should change something. So now it's the time for me to thank again Anne, Jean-Claude, but also all the speakers of the day, and of course the fantastic colleagues in the back office, Nadia, Rasami, Noemi, and everybody that made this possible. Thank you very much for watching us, and see you tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Thank you, Julia, for your contribution too.
Yes, thanks a lot, Julia, and thanks for the organization.
Thank you. Bye.